Hi, I'm Thom Tillis, Senator from the great state of North Carolina and formerly Speaker of the House for the North Carolina State House. I want to thank the Pelican Institute for inviting me to talk with you a little bit about the work that we did for tax reform in North Carolina. But before that, I want to tell you I've got a little bit of history in Louisiana. I was the proud student at West Wego Elementary and Liverdays Middle School. I love Louisiana and I follow your politics closely, having some roots there. When I was asked about the tax reform, what worked and what we did in North Carolina, we have to go back to 2010 when I was the campaign chair for winning a majority in the North Carolina State House and becoming ultimately only the second Republican speaker in about 100 years. We had inherited a devastated economy after the Great Recession. In my first 6 weeks on the job, I found out that we had a $2.5 billion deficit, and we had to solve that problem inside of about 6 months. We also had a lot of businesses that were closed or suffering. Our unemployment rate was there were only 3 states ahead of us. We were at 10.4% unemployment, a $2.5 billion deficit, $750 million of which was a Medicaid shortfall for the in-year spending. And what we decided to do was start by just stabilizing the situation. We had to figure out how to reduce our spending, and we didn't spend a lot of time on tax reform in those first 2 years. What we decided to do instead is focus on regulatory reform to remove the taxation, effectively taxation, that comes with overly burdensome regulation. So we spent our first 2 years just really trying to get the business climate right from a regulatory perspective, and we took hundreds of millions of dollars of regulatory burden off the backs of businesses. We did simple things too, and this may apply in Louisiana in the wake of the COVID crisis. We looked at all of these permits. We had a very strong economy in February of last year. We knew a lot of businesses were seeking permits, maybe building buildings, trying to expand existing businesses. And the first thing that we did was simply extend the dates for many permits by about 2 years, because we'd been suffering from the recession for the better part of 2.5 years. That really started stimulating economic activity, and it gave us the first currency that we needed to really begin to fund tax cuts. We also got our budget in line over the objections of the Democrat governor. We got a veto override on a budget with Democratic support so that we knew what our baseline costs were and managing them going forward. Then in our second term, we really started taking a look at our taxation. We had a 7.75% top tax rate for personal income, and we wanted to reduce it, but this was the first controversial piece that we had. I didn't feel like we should go after individual income tax rates until we reduced the corporate tax burden. We had the highest corporate tax virtually in the country for states that have corporate tax base. It was at 6.9. So our first tranche of tax reform was to lower the corporate tax. We started with 1% increments. We passed into law a vision for the future that ultimately got us down to 3%. But we did it in 1% increments, and the next tax cut would only take place if our estimates on revenue proved to be true, and they did. We saw more business activity, we saw great job growth, and that really allowed us to create the resources that we then needed to go into income tax and sales tax. We reduced the sales tax rate in the state of North Carolina by 1%, from 5.75 down to 4.75. The way that we did that was to broaden the base so that we could lower the rate. We also reduced personal income tax from that top rate of 7.75% down to what is now less than 5.5%. We improved standard deductions, and in fact, we took about 40,000 North Carolinians off of the tax rolls entirely. They were no longer required to pay state income tax. Now, the one thing I will tell you, when you get into the discussion of tax reform, all of your friends are going to come in and say, yeah, we're for it. What they won't tell you is they still want to maintain that one exemption that they consider to be a righteous exemption. If you're going to do tax reform, if you're going to broaden the base and lower the rate, everything has to be on the table. I'll give you one good example. When we were going after personal income tax, we decided, so that we could have certainty, we decided to cap the mortgage interest deduction. And the fact of the matter is, 85 to 90% of all North Carolinians were never going to get above the cap. Some were. But by capping it, we had certainty in terms of what our revenue picture was going to be. That gave us more confidence to go after other exemptions and exceptions. We did, in expanding the sales tax base, we decided to go into categories that hadn't been taxed before, particularly taxes on services. That caused a lot of our friends also to express concern. But when we communicated to them at the end of the day, the lower sales tax rate was going to be beneficial to them as payers of sales tax, we got them on board. Wasn't easy, wasn't without a few fights, but it was ultimately very successful. So much so, when I came in as speaker, we were in the 4th quartile by every major economic indicator. We had a very dismal story to tell in terms of job creation and corporate relocations and growth. Now we're number 11. For the last 3 years, we've been Forbes' most attractive business environment. And the way that we did that was by continuing to look at how we could better compete in the Southeast region and how we could better compete nationally. This year, with COVID hitting our shores, we're posting a $4 billion surplus in 2020 revenues. We have posted a surplus for the last 7 years after we did tax reform. We've also replenished a rainy day fund that had $0 in it when I became Speaker of the House, and last year we had $1.2 billion in it after we'd had 3 significant hurricane events. So instead of giving you a long list of details, which I'm happy to share with you, and we will share with the Pelican Institute and our colleagues in the legislature, I want to tell you more about the strategy and more about doing it in phases, and look at that individual income tax or even the sales tax reform as the second thing you do after you figure out ways to stimulate business activity in Louisiana. I am looking for the opportunity to actually meet with you in person. Be happy to have my staff share with you a lot of technical documents and the approach and the timeline, the way that we went about doing it, the lessons learned. But there's a reason why North Carolina right now is held out as the best state in this century for implementing tax reform, never having to reverse any of the decisions we've made, and then creating the currency and the economic activity to continue to cut the cost of doing business through regulatory reform and through smart, business-friendly, job-creating tax reform. So thank you all for giving me an opportunity to speak with you. I look forward to coming down to your state and sharing maybe a few of the scars and a lot of the successes that we've had in North Carolina. We'd love to do everything we can to have you have the same positive impact on Louisiana that we have in my great state of North Carolina. Thank you for your time, and thanks again to the Pelican Institute for inviting me to give you at least some glimpse of the work that I've been involved in back when I was in the State House. Take care.